August 17th, 1943, 25,000 feet above Schweinfurt, Germany. Hauptmann Egon Mayer pushed his Focke-Wulf 190A-6 into a diving attack, leading his entire Gruppe in a head-on assault against the American bomber formation below. He had shot down 102 Allied aircraft in 3 years of combat. He understood exactly how to destroy heavy bombers. Attack from the front where defensive armament was weakest. Close to within 300 yards, fire a concentrated burst of cannon and machine gun fire into the cockpit and engines. Watch the bomber fall out of formation, crippled and vulnerable to follow-up attacks. Mayer had developed the head-on attack technique specifically to exploit the B-17's weak frontal armament. His tactics had proven devastatingly effective against bombers flying in loose formations, where each aircraft was essentially alone despite flying near other bombers. But today, something was fundamentally different. Something that Mayer and Luftwaffe fighter commanders had dismissed as American inexperience and poor tactical thinking. As his fighters screamed toward the bomber formation at a combined closing speed exceeding 550 miles per hour, what happened next would shatter every assumption the Luftwaffe held about bomber vulnerability. The Americans weren't flying a loose formation. They were flying something the Luftwaffe intelligence officers had observed in recent weeks and ridiculed in their reports. A combat box formation where bombers flew in a precisely coordinated three-dimensional arrangement designed to create interlocking fields of defensive fire. Mayer's attack approach, which should have allowed him to target a single bomber with minimal defensive fire, instead brought him into the crosshairs of 12 B-17s simultaneously. Over 50 .50-caliber machine guns swiveled toward his fighter. The sky ahead of Mayer erupted in a storm of tracers, not the scattered defensive fire he expected from a few bomber gunners, but a concentrated wall of lead that filled the space his fighter had to fly through. Mayer's wingman exploded in mid-air, struck by multiple gun streams simultaneously. The fighter to his left disintegrated, its pilot killed instantly. Mayer himself felt impacts as rounds punched through his wing and fuselage. His aircraft shuddered violently. Only his combat experience and split-second reaction saved him as he rolled violently left and dove away, breaking off the attack before reaching effective firing range. As he pulled out of the dive at 15,000 feet, oil streaming from his damaged engine, Mayer understood with terrible clarity that American bomber tactics had evolved beyond anything Luftwaffe intelligence had anticipated. The mathematics of defensive firepower were being rewritten, not through better guns or more ammunition, but through geometric precision that turned individual bombers into a single weapons system. The transformation had begun 18 months earlier, not with brilliant innovation, but with desperate recognition that current tactics were killing American aircrews at unsustainable rates. February 1942. Langley Field, Virginia. Colonel Curtis LeMay studied combat reports from British bomber operations over Germany with growing concern. RAF Bomber Command was suffering catastrophic losses during daylight operations. German fighters attacked British bombers in loose formations, picking them off one at a time. Individual bombers, even when flying near other aircraft, couldn't provide mutual defensive support effectively because the formations were too loose. Guns from one bomber couldn't cover another bomber if they were separated by hundreds of yards. The British had concluded that daylight bombing was impossible against determined fighter opposition. They shifted to night operations, accepting reduced bombing accuracy in exchange for survivability. But American doctrine was built around daylight precision bombing. The Norden bomb site, the heavily armed B-17 flying fortress, the entire strategic bombing campaign depended on hitting targets accurately in daylight. If daylight operations were impossible, the entire American strategic bombing doctrine would have to be abandoned. LeMay refused to accept this conclusion. The B-17 carried 13 50-caliber machine guns in various positions. Each gun could fire 800 rounds per minute. Theoretically, a B-17 could defend itself effectively. But combat reports showed that individual bombers were being shot down regularly despite their heavy armament. The problem wasn't the guns. The problem was geometry. A single bomber, no matter how heavily armed, could only bring a fraction of its guns to bear on any attacking fighter at any given moment. A fighter attacking from directly ahead faced only the limited forward-firing guns. A fighter attacking from below faced only the ball turret. A fighter attacking from the side faced only the waist guns. The bomber's total defensive firepower was divided across multiple positions, but each position could only engage targets in its specific arc of fire. LeMay's insight was that bombers needed to fly close enough together that their defensive fire zones overlapped. If 10 bombers flew in formation, positioned so that each bomber's guns could cover approaches to adjacent bombers, then any fighter attacking any bomber in the formation would face defensive fire from multiple aircraft simultaneously. The combined firepower would be overwhelming. The concept seemed simple in theory. Implementation proved extraordinarily complex. Bomber formations in early 1942 were loose by modern standards. Aircraft flew several hundred yards apart, providing room for maneuvering and reducing mid-air collision risks. Pilots maintained formation visually, adjusting position constantly to stay roughly in the correct location relative to other aircraft. This worked adequately for navigation and mutual support during flight, but provided minimal defensive benefit. Guns from one bomber couldn't effectively engage fighters attacking another bomber hundreds of yards away. LeMay proposed tightening the formation dramatically. Bombers would fly within 50 to 100 yards of each other, close enough that defensive fire zones overlapped completely. Any fighter approaching the formation would face guns from multiple bombers, regardless of its attack angle. The objections from experienced bomber pilots were immediate and vehement. Flying 35,000-pound aircraft at 25,000 feet in formation, separated by only 50 yards, was extraordinarily dangerous. The slightest pilot error, control malfunction, or turbulence could cause mid-air collisions that would destroy multiple aircraft instantly. Formation flying at that proximity required constant, intense concentration. Pilots would be exhausted after missions lasting 8 or 10 hours. Engine failures or battle damage requiring emergency maneuvers would endanger other aircraft in the tight formation. Most critically, pilots had been trained in loose formation flying. Teaching them to fly precise close formations would require months of intensive training. But LeMay had mathematics on his side. He calculated that a properly designed combat box formation could bring approximately 200 to 300 machine guns to bear on any attacking fighter regardless of the attack angle. No fighter could survive flying through that concentration of fire. The increased mid-air collision risk was real but statistically smaller than the certainty of being shot down by fighters if bombers continued flying loose formations. In March 1942, LeMay received command of the 305th Bombardment Group, equipped with B-17E flying fortresses. He immediately began training his crews in tight formation flying. The training was brutal. Pilots flew practice missions 6 days a week, spending hours maintaining precise formation positions. LeMay established standards measured in feet rather than yards. The lead bomber's wingtip would be positioned exactly 50 feet from the next bomber's wingtip. Vertical separation between elements would be exactly 75 feet. Pilots who couldn't maintain position within these tolerances were relieved of command and reassigned. Navigators and bombardiers were trained to work in formation, with only the lead aircraft's bombardier actually controlling the bombing run. When the lead bombardier released his bombs, every other bombardier in the formation would release simultaneously. This concentration of bombs from multiple aircraft would saturate the target area, compensating for individual bombing errors and increasing the probability of destroying the objective. Gunners were trained in coordinated fire procedures. They learned to track targets being engaged by adjacent aircraft, adding their fire to create concentrated streams that no fighter could evade. The ball turret gunner would call out fighters approaching from below. The tail gunner would warn of fighters approaching from behind. The top turret gunner would engage fighters attacking from above. Each gunner became part of an integrated weapons system rather than an isolated defensive position. By October 1942, the 305th Bombardment Group flew the tightest, most precise bomber formations in the 8th Air Force. LeMay's aircraft maintained formation positions within 10 feet of specified locations through hours-long missions. When the group deployed to England in November 1942, they brought their formation tactics with them. The initial Luftwaffe response to American combat box formations was dismissive contempt. German fighter pilots had been destroying British bombers for 2 years. They had developed sophisticated tactics, carefully refined through combat experience. The head-on attack pioneered by Egon Mayer and others concentrated fire on the bomber's weakest point. The high-speed slashing attack from above and behind allowed fighters to attack and escape before defensive guns could track them effectively. The systematic destruction of bomber formations by targeting stragglers and damaged aircraft first, then working through the formation methodically. German intelligence officers examining gun camera footage from early engagements with American combat box formations reported that the Americans flew in unnecessarily tight formations that increased mid-air collision risks without providing meaningful defensive advantages. The assessment concluded that American bomber crews were inexperienced and poorly trained, attempting to compensate for lack of skill through rigid adherence to close formation flying that would break apart under sustained fighter attack. This assessment proved catastrophically wrong. December 20th, 1942. The Luftwaffe attacked an American bomber formation targeting the Romilly-sur-Seine airfield in occupied France. The German fighters expected the tight American formation to break apart when attacked, with individual bombers becoming easy targets once formation discipline collapsed. Instead, the American formation tightened further when attacked. Bombers closed gaps, maintaining positions with mechanical precision. German fighters approaching from any angle found themselves facing defensive fire from 6, 8, sometimes 10 bombers simultaneously. The concentrated fire was unlike anything Luftwaffe pilots had experienced. Hauptmann Hans-Joachim Marseille, transferred from North Africa to defend the Reich, led an attack from the bomber's 6 o'clock position, approaching from directly behind where he expected to face only tail guns from his target bomber. Instead, he found himself under fire from tail guns of 5 bombers, waist guns from 4 more, and ball turrets from 3 others. Over 40 machine guns firing at his single fighter. Marseille's wingman was shot down instantly. Marseille himself took hits that shredded his left elevator and punctured his fuel tank. He barely made it back to base, his fighter trailing smoke and fuel. His combat report stated simply, "American formation tactics create defensive fire zones that cannot be penetrated by conventional attack methods." Other German pilots reported similar experiences. Attacks that should have been routine resulted in heavy fighter losses without corresponding bomber kills. The few bombers shot down had been hit by concentrated fire from multiple fighters attacking simultaneously, requiring coordination and timing that was difficult to achieve in the chaos of combat. Luftwaffe fighter commanders recognized they faced a tactical problem requiring new solutions. The Luftwaffe's response evolved through early 1943. New attack tactics were developed specifically to counter American combat box formations. Massed head-on attacks by entire Gruppen of fighters would concentrate overwhelming firepower against a small section of the formation, accepting heavy fighter losses to achieve bomber kills. The frontal attack remained the Americans' weakest defensive sector despite improvements, standing off beyond defensive gun range and firing rockets or cannon at the formation from distance. This reduced accuracy, but kept fighters outside the lethal defensive fire zones, targeting the formation's lead aircraft. If the lead bomber could be destroyed, the formation would lose cohesion as remaining bombers struggled to reorganize. High-speed diving attacks from directly above, passing through the formation so quickly that defensive gunners couldn't track effectively, attacking stragglers that fell behind the formation due to battle damage or mechanical problems. Individual bombers outside the formation's protective fire zones remained vulnerable. These new tactics achieved results, but at a cost. German fighter losses increased dramatically as they pressed attacks against formations bristling with defensive firepower. Meanwhile, American formation tactics continued evolving. LeMay's combat box concept was refined and standardized across the 8th Air Force. By spring 1943, the standard combat box consisted of 21 bombers arranged in a three-dimensional formation. The formation comprised 3 squadrons of 7 aircraft each. The lead squadron flew at the formation's center and highest altitude. The low squadron flew approximately 500 feet below and offset to the left. The high squadron flew approximately 500 feet above the lead and offset to the right. Within each squadron, aircraft flew in a tight V formation. 3 bombers formed the lead element, with the squadron commander in the center. 2 additional V elements of 2 aircraft each flew, stepped down behind and to the sides of the lead element. This arrangement created a formation roughly 1,000 feet wide, 1,000 feet deep, and 1,000 feet tall. The genius of the design was geometric. From any approach angle, attacking fighters faced fire from multiple bombers. A fighter attacking from directly ahead faced nose guns from all 21 bombers. A fighter attacking from the right side faced waist guns from at least 10 bombers. A fighter attacking from below faced ball turrets from at least 6 bombers. There was no safe approach angle. The defensive fire zones overlapped completely. Every cubic foot of space surrounding the combat box fell within the firing arcs of multiple machine guns. The formation's vertical and horizontal offsets meant that bombers at different altitudes could fire at targets threatening bombers on other levels without risk of hitting friendly aircraft. The concentration of firepower was staggering. Each B-17 carried approximately 11,000 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition distributed across its 13 gun positions. A 21 aircraft combat box carried approximately 231,000 rounds total. At typical combat ranges and engagement times, the formation could fire approximately 40,000 rounds per minute. No fighter formation could survive sustained exposure to this fire volume, but the combat box formation created challenges beyond the obvious difficulty of flying in close formation. The lead aircraft bore enormous responsibility. The lead pilot had to navigate accurately, maintain proper airspeed and altitude, and fly a steady course that the entire formation could follow. The lead bombardier controlled when all 21 aircraft released their bombs. If the lead aircraft was shot down, command passed to the deputy lead, but the transition caused confusion and degraded formation effectiveness. Aircraft in the formation's most exposed positions, particularly the low squadron, faced disproportionate danger. German fighters learned to target the low squadron first, attacking from below, where the geometric advantages of the combat box were least pronounced. Low squadron aircraft had fewer bombers beneath them to provide covering fire against attacks from below. The low squadron also flew in disturbed air from propeller wash of aircraft above, making formation flying more difficult. Pilots assigned to low squadron positions understood they faced the highest risk. Mid-air collisions were an ever-present danger. With aircraft separated by only 50 to 100 feet, flying through weather, maneuvering to avoid flak, and dealing with battle damage, the collision risk was significant. Several tragic incidents occurred when damaged bombers lost control and struck other aircraft in the formation. Pilots who lost engines and couldn't maintain formation speed faced an agonizing choice: fall behind and become vulnerable to fighter attack, or maintain position and risk collision as their damaged aircraft became increasingly difficult to control. The physical demands on pilots were severe. Maintaining precise formation position for 8 to 10 hours at high altitude in the thin, freezing air at 25,000 feet required absolute concentration. Pilots flew with oxygen masks and heavy flight suits, managing throttle, trim, and control inputs constantly to hold position. The mental strain was as exhausting as the physical demands. Formation discipline had to be maintained despite flak bursts, fighter attacks, and the sight of other bombers in the formation being shot down. But the tactical advantages justified these challenges. Combat statistics from spring and summer 1943 proved that bombers flying in tight combat box formations had dramatically better survival rates than bombers in loose formations or individual aircraft separated from formations. April through July 1943 saw the combat box formation's effectiveness demonstrated conclusively through brutal attrition of German fighter forces that attempted to attack properly disciplined American formations. July 28, 1943. A mission to Kassel targeting aircraft factories in central Germany. Luftwaffe fighter controllers vectored approximately 150 fighters against the attacking B-17 formations. The German fighters concentrated their attacks, using massed frontal assaults by entire Gruppen to overwhelm defensive fire through sheer numbers. The tactic achieved results. 15 B-17s were shot down from a total force of 182 bombers, but the cost to German fighter forces was staggering. American gunners claimed 38 German fighters destroyed and 22 more damaged. Luftwaffe records confirmed 33 fighters lost and 19 damaged beyond immediate repair. The exchange ratio was devastating. For every bomber destroyed, German forces lost more than 2 fighters. This was unsustainable. Bombers could be replaced by American industry relatively quickly. Trained fighter pilots took months or years to develop and were irreplaceable. The mission demonstrated that attacking American combat box formations directly was tactical suicide for German fighter forces. Yet German fighters had no choice. If they didn't attack the bombers would destroy German industry. The strategic dilemma was unsolvable. August 17, 1943. The infamous Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission. This mission pushed the limits of bomber range and faced the heaviest German fighter opposition yet encountered. A total of 376 B-17s attacked ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt and aircraft factories at Regensburg. Luftwaffe fighter controllers assembled over 300 fighters from across Germany and occupied Europe to intercept the raid. The battle lasted over 3 hours as bomber formations fought their way to targets deep in southern Germany and back. The combat box formations held despite unprecedented fighter opposition. German fighters pressed attacks with suicidal determination. Massed frontal attacks by 30 to 40 fighters simultaneously created brief gaps in defensive fire as gunners tracked multiple targets. Some bombers were shot down. Some formations lost cohesion when lead aircraft were destroyed. But the majority of combat boxes maintained integrity throughout the mission, their defensive fire destroying German fighters at rates that shocked Luftwaffe commanders. American gunners claimed 288 German fighters destroyed during the mission. This claim was inflated by overclaiming common in combat's chaos, with multiple gunners claiming credit for the same kill. Post-war analysis of German records suggests approximately 100 fighters were actually lost, with another 50 damaged, but even these reduced numbers represented catastrophic losses for German fighter forces. The Luftwaffe lost the equivalent of 5 entire Gruppen in a single day. More critically, many lost pilots were experienced leaders and instructors whose expertise couldn't be replaced. American bomber losses were also severe. 60 B-17s were shot down, a loss rate of 16%. This exceeded sustainable attrition rates, but analysis of which bombers were lost proved revealing. Nearly all losses were aircraft that had fallen out of formation due to battle damage or mechanical problems, or formations that had lost so many aircraft that defensive gaps appeared which German fighters exploited. Combat boxes that maintained formation integrity throughout the mission had loss rates below 10%. The lesson was clear. Formation discipline determined survival. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission forced both sides to reassess their tactics. For the Americans, the mission demonstrated that even well-flown combat box formations couldn't prevent heavy losses when facing overwhelming fighter opposition without friendly fighter escort. The mission accelerated development of long-range escort fighter operations. For the Germans, the mission proved that attacking American combat box formations cost unsustainable fighter losses even when attacks succeeded. New tactics were needed. The Luftwaffe's response in fall 1943 emphasized attacking bombers before they formed up into combat boxes, targeting stragglers more aggressively, and using standoff weapons like rockets to attack from beyond defensive gun range. But these tactics only partially addressed the fundamental problem. Properly flown American combat box formations had defensive firepower that German fighters couldn't overcome without prohibitive losses. October 1943 brought refinements to American formation tactics. The standard 21-aircraft combat box evolved into larger composite formations. 3 combat boxes would fly together as a combat wing, creating a formation of 63 bombers arranged in 3 staggered boxes. The lead box flew at center altitude. The low box flew 1,000 feet below and offset left. The high box flew 1,000 feet above and offset right. This created a formation nearly 2 miles wide, 1 mile deep, and half a mile tall, containing 63 bombers with approximately 800 machine guns. Multiple combat wings would fly together in bomber streams, extending for dozens of miles, with hundreds of bombers proceeding to targets in coordinated waves. The scale of these formations staggered German defenders. Individual fighter attacks against formations of this size were futile. Even massed attacks by entire fighter wings could only engage small portions of the bomber stream. The defensive firepower was simply overwhelming. Lieutenant Werner Hauptmann, flying a Messerschmitt Bf 109G6 with Jagdgeschwader 3, described attacking these massive formations in November 1943. We would climb to altitude and see the bombers coming, not individual bombers or small groups, but formations extending to the horizon, Hundreds of aircraft in precise formations, each formation with so many guns that approaching meant flying through a wall of fire. We pressed attacks because we had to, but everyone knew the mathematics. Every attack run might be your last. You selected a target, dove to attack, and prayed you'd survive long enough to fire your weapons and break away. Many didn't. I saw friends' aircraft disintegrate, hit by concentrated fire from multiple bombers. The Americans had solved bomber defense through geometry and discipline. We had no answer except courage, and courage alone cannot defeat mathematics. Hauptmann survived the war with 25 victories, but was shot down 4 times, each time while attacking bomber formations. His experience was typical of German fighter pilots in late 1943 and 1944. The statistical reality of combat box effectiveness became undeniable by early 1944. Missions flown with proper formation discipline had bomber loss rates averaging 3 to 4%, considered acceptable. Missions where formations broke apart due to fighter attack or other causes had loss rates exceeding 15%. The correlation between formation integrity and survival was absolute. Bomber crews understood this viscerally. The safest place during combat was tight inside the formation. Aircraft that fell out of formation, whether due to damage, mechanical problems, or pilot error, were doomed. German fighters would swarm stragglers, attacking from all angles without facing coordinated defensive fire. Dozens of bombers were lost this way throughout 1943 and 1944. The psychological pressure to maintain formation regardless of damage or difficulty was enormous. Pilots flew crippled aircraft, engines failing and controls damaged, maintaining formation position until literally unable to control their aircraft. The alternative was certain death. Technical specifications of the combat box formation reveal the engineering precision required. The lead bomber flew at specified altitude and airspeed. The second element flew 50 feet to the left and 25 feet back. The third element flew 50 feet to the right and 25 feet back. The second squadron's lead element flew 500 feet below and 200 feet back from the first squadron's lead. Positions were specified in feet, and aircraft were expected to maintain these positions within 10-foot tolerance. This required constant pilot attention. At 160 mph indicated airspeed, a 10-foot spacing error would occur within half a second if pilots weren't making constant control adjustments. The formation had to maintain integrity through turns, altitude changes, weather, and combat. Pilots were trained to follow the lead aircraft's every move precisely, maintaining exact relative position regardless of what the lead did. If the lead turned, everyone turned. If the lead climbed, everyone climbed at the same rate. This eliminated the accordion effect, where small spacing errors would compound through the formation. The bombardier coordination required for the formation to function as a single bombing system was equally precise. The lead bombardier would make all bombing calculations, tracking wind, altitude, airspeed, and target position. At the release point, the lead bombardier would toggle his bomb release. This sent an electrical signal to light a release lamp visible to all bombardiers in the formation. Every bombardier, seeing the lamp illuminate, would instantly toggle their own release. The result was that 21 aircraft released 42,000 pounds of bombs within 1 second, creating a bomb pattern that saturated the target area. This pattern bombing compensated for individual bombing errors and dramatically increased the probability of target destruction. A single bomber might miss a small target. 21 bombers releasing simultaneously would blanket the target area, ensuring hits. The training required to achieve this coordination was extensive. Bomber crews practiced formation flying for months before being certified combat-ready. Pilots spent hundreds of hours learning to maintain precise formation positions. Bombardiers trained in formation bombing runs, learning to react instantly to the lead bombardier's release signal. Gunners trained in coordinated fire procedures, tracking targets and adding their fire to streams from other aircraft. The maintenance burden of keeping 21 aircraft operationally ready for formation missions was substantial. If even one bomber aborted due to mechanical problems, it created a gap in the formation that weakened defensive fire coverage. Groups struggled to launch full 21 aircraft formations consistently. Spare aircraft were positioned to fill gaps when primary aircraft aborted, but this created crew coordination issues as substitute crews flew in formations they hadn't trained with. By late 1943, a typical heavy bombardment group would launch 25 to 28 aircraft to achieve 21 aircraft over the target, accounting for mechanical aborts and early returns. The human cost of formation flying was measured not just in combat losses but in operational accidents. Mid-air collisions occurred with tragic regularity. Aircraft damaged by flak or fighters would lose control and strike other bombers in the formation. Formation assembly in poor weather led to collisions as bombers climbed through clouds attempting to join up. Landing accidents increased as damaged bombers returned to base simultaneously with other formation aircraft, creating congestion and collision risks. The 100th Bombardment Group, known as the Bloody 100th, due to their high loss rates, suffered numerous formation-related accidents in addition to combat losses. The Luftwaffe's final major attempt to defeat American combat box formations came in March 1944. German fighter forces concentrated against specific bomber formations, accepting prohibitive losses in exchange for destroying enough bombers to make the missions strategically ineffective. The attacks failed. Even when German fighters successfully shot down bombers from well-flown combat boxes, the loss rates weren't high enough to stop the bombing campaign. By April 1944, German fighter opposition over most targets had declined dramatically. Fuel shortages, pilot losses, and the appearance of American long-range escort fighters ended the period when German fighters could attack bomber formations in strength. The combat box formation had succeeded in its primary purpose, keeping enough bombers alive to deliver their ordnance on target. The final statistics tell the story of how formation tactics transformed bomber survivability. In 1942 and early 1943, before combat box formations were standardized, bomber loss rates averaged 6 to 8% per mission on heavily defended targets. After combat box formations became standard in mid-1943, loss rates on comparable targets averaged 3 to 5%. The reduction seems modest, but was strategically critical. At 8% loss rates, bomber groups couldn't sustain operations. Crews were expected to fly 25 missions to complete a combat tour. At 8% loss per mission, statistical probability of completing a tour was approximately 14%. At 4% loss per mission, probability increased to approximately 36%. Formation tactics doubled crew survival rates. Between August and December 1943, the period of heaviest air combat over Germany before long-range escort fighters became common, American bomber formations shot down approximately 800 German fighters according to German loss records. American gunner claims totaled over 3,000 fighters destroyed, illustrating the overclaiming common when multiple gunners fired at the same target. But even the conservative German records show that bomber defensive fire, concentrated through combat box formations, destroyed fighters at rates that crippled German fighter forces. The 800 fighters lost represented approximately 40% of German single-engine fighter strength on the Western Front. These losses occurred in just 5 months. Replacement aircraft could be manufactured, replacement pilots could not be trained fast enough. The quality of German fighter forces declined steadily as experienced pilots were killed and replaced by inadequately trained newcomers who survived only a few missions before being shot down themselves. The combat box formation represented a triumph of tactical doctrine over technological limitation. The B-17 Flying Fortress was not inherently superior to German fighters. In speed, climb rate, and maneuverability, German fighters held clear advantages. But through formation tactics that concentrated defensive firepower geometrically, American bombers created a tactical situation where technological advantages were neutralized. German fighters that should have been able to destroy bombers easily instead found themselves unable to attack without flying through lethal fire concentrations. The simple act of flying in precise formation transformed individual bombers into something greater than the sum of their parts. Luftwaffe fighter commanders who had dismissed American formation tactics as evidence of poor training learned too late that geometric precision could defeat aerodynamic performance. The flying fortresses that German intelligence had mocked became truly fortress-like, not through armor or armament improvements, but through tactical discipline that turned scattered defensive guns into integrated weapons systems. The mathematics had changed. Where a single bomber might bring 4 or 5 guns to bear on an attacking fighter, a combat box brought 50 guns to bear. No fighter could survive that fire concentration. The transformation from vulnerable individual bombers to lethal defensive formations occurred within 12 months, driven by tactical innovation rather than technological advancement, proving that sometimes the solution to seemingly unsolvable problems lies not in building better weapons, but in using existing weapons more intelligently. The Luftwaffe discovered this truth at the cost of hundreds of experienced fighter pilots and eventual loss of air superiority over the Reich, defeated not by superior American aircraft, but by superior American tactics that turned formations of bombers into flying fortresses that lived up to their name.